You live and learn, they say. But the sad truth is very often you don't. And there is, in truth, nothing about the process of living that inevitably causes learning. 40 years experience could easily turn out to, at the time of crisis to have been just 1 year's experience 40 times over. Last time we left a modified Moses in chapter 4, a very different man from the one in Exodus 2. The one in Exodus 2 showed us when he was still a man who thought he would deliver his people by force when he killed the Egyptian slave driver. And by chapter 4, having learned to place less confidence in his own human strength and ability, he stumbles off towards Egypt with nothing more than a stutter and a stick, simply because the God of his fathers has sent him to go there and promised to go with him all the way. Now Moses is a man ready to lean only on the Lord. And that's the sort of man that the Lord God Almighty can do mighty things with. So here in Exodus 7 to 12, he's about to do just that. But if we only see what God is doing with Moses here, that's very important. If we only see that, we're going to miss the point. The big point gets made in Exodus chapter 15 with the first song of praise in the Bible called the Song of the Sea that follows what God's about to do. And the final line of that declares the point. The Lord reigns as king. The Lord reigns as king. The song retells in poetry what God's kingdom is all about. And this incident in Exodus 7 to 12, this set of incidents, is all about that. The Lord reigns as king. So God's on a mission to confront evil in the world, redeem those enslaved to evil, bring them to the promised land, where his divine presence is going to live among them. It's about God and his kingdom. And this is what it looks like when God becomes king in his people's hearts, and then increasingly in the world in which he calls them to serve him. That's the big thing behind all that's going on here. And God achieves this one person at a time. But we need to get to the essential issue here, also one step at a time. Let's look first at the passage's structure, try and distill its meaning, and then examine the relationship between the different parts of the narrative to pull out the main themes for us to learn from here today. So the overall narrative structure then of this text in Exodus 7 through 12. There's this highly structured progression detailing Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh and the subsequent plagues. And we can divide it up roughly like this. There's this introduction of Moses' mission and God's instructions to him. That's Exodus 7, 1 to 7. That sets out the groundwork of God's role for Moses and Aaron. And God tells Moses he's made him like God to Pharaoh, meaning that Moses will act with divine authority as he deals with him. And Aaron is going to serve as Moses' prophet or his spokesperson. Then you get the instructions for Moses and Aaron. Moses is to relay God's commands. Aaron will speak them out to Pharaoh, instructing him to let the Israelites go from Egypt. Now, that's a pretty big deal in itself because that's a risky thing to do and it requires a lot of trust in God and not in ourselves. Moses he recognizes now he's got none of the natural talent, gifts, or anything else, but he's relying on God for that. But Pharaoh's heart gets hardened. God warns Moses he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and it'll make Pharaoh resist and refuse to release the Israelites, despite the many signs and wonders that are performed through Moses in Egypt. And then there's a bit about God's judgment on Egypt. God's plan includes powerful acts of judgment on Egypt to eventually compel Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Pharaoh and Egypt they are an evil, evil empire. They're going to turn out to be pretty much unmendable. But God has got a plan, and God's plan includes that judgment on these people. And there will be some recognition on their part of God's power, and God says that to Moses next. This is what's going to happen. God declares the Egyptians will come to know that he is the Lord when he stretches out his hand in judgment and frees the Israelites. Well, excuse me, what happens next is Moses and Aaron faithfully follow the Lord's commands. And we're told they do this as old guys. We're told that at the time they confront Pharaoh, Moses is 80 years old and Aaron is 83. Well, in Exodus 7:8-13, we get the first confrontation and the first sign. Moses performs this miracle. God instructs a miracle. He tells Moses and Aaron that when Pharaoh asks for a miracle, Aaron should throw down his staff and it'll turn into a snake. He's done that before. He's had practice and he's to do that. And he obeys. They do exactly as instructed. And Aaron's staff becomes a snake in front of Pharaoh and his officials. And then out come the Egyptian magicians. And they perform what the New Testament goes on to call lying wonders. They do the same tricks, as it were. They repeat the miracle. They turn their staffs into snakes using magic arts. But then we see the superiority of Aaron's miracle. Aaron's staff in snake form swallows up the magician's staffs, showing God's power is greater. Who's going to be king here? See the theme? And then, of course, Pharaoh hardens his heart because his heart is given over to this evil and wickedness. And despite witnessing that miracle, Pharaoh's heart becomes hard and he refuses to listen to Moses and Aaron, fulfilling God's earlier warning and proving, I guess, the saying that goes, seeing isn't believing, but believing is seeing. Well, let me get the 10 plagues, Exodus 7:14-12, verse 30. And the first 9 plagues, I guess, in the sequence are marked by escalating intensity and repeated hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And as you harden your heart against God, it gets harder still. So what happens in Exodus 7:14 to say 10:29? God sends a series of 10 plagues, and this is the first 9, on Egypt, devastating plagues, to convince Pharaoh to free the Israelites. But the 10th is distinct, you see, from the others in character and impact, dealing with it separately. The big deal is that despite severe suffering, Pharaoh repeatedly hardens his heart and refuses to let God's people go. And the plagues are progressively severe, showing God's power and control over nature and the Egyptian deities. He's king. And the key moments are the plague 1, the water turns to blood, the Nile River turns to blood, killing fish and causing undrinkable water. That which was the life of Egypt is becoming the means of their death. Then there's plague 2, the frogs, chapter 8, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse 15. Frogs swarm all over Egypt, making the land really difficult to work and give its food. And Pharaoh briefly relents, but then he hardens his heart again. Plague 3, the gnats. Chapter 8, verses 16-19. Dust becomes gnats. And the magicians fail to replicate that miracle. And then plague 4, it's ramping up. Flies, swarms of flies. But none in Goshen, the Israelites' region. There's a message being sent. Plague 5, livestock disease. Chapter 9, verses 1-7. Egyptian livestock die. Israelite livestock are spared. Plague 6, boils. Chapter 9, verses 8-12. Painful boils afflicting Egyptians and animals. Plague 7, hail. Chapter 9, verse 13-35. Destructive hailstorms ruin the crops and kill the livestock so hard. And Pharaoh temporarily relents and then hardens his heart again. He goes back again. So along comes plague 8, the locusts, in chapter 10, verses 1-20. Locusts devour crops, leaving nothing behind. No food in Egypt, fertile Egypt. Plague 9 brings darkness across the face of the land for 3 days, except in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. Chapter 10, 21-29. It's obviously being one of God's people, part of his kingdom, under his authority as king. That's the way to be here. And yet they're not getting that. They're not getting that message in Egypt, are they? And that leads us to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn and the institution of the Passover. In Exodus 11:1 to 12:32, you get these events spelled out. God announces the final plague, the death of the firstborn. And that does prompt Pharaoh to release the Israelites, although he has a bit of a go back on that later on, and things happen in the sea that are really, he's brought on his own head. God instructs Moses to establish the Passover. So Israelites mark their doorposts with lamb's blood, and the plague passes over them, and their firstborn are not killed. But at midnight, every Egyptian firstborn dies, including Pharaoh's son, leading him to finally let the Israelites get out into the desert and go. Now, there are key insights and important facts here. God's final warning, the 10th and final plague, the death of all Egyptian firstborns. The Passover instructions, the Israelites had to sacrifice a lamb. Here's the death of the lamb, bringing their deliverance. As they eat that Passover meal, fellowship with God. They must eat unleavened bread and be ready to leave quickly. And then that 10th plague hits. Israelite homes are spared. Devastated Pharaoh demands, chapter 12, verses 31 to 32, that the Israelites leave Egypt. And the Israelites leave. The story moves from confrontation to judgment and finally to deliverance, showing both the theological meaning of the plagues and their relationship to the larger themes of covenant, God's covenant love for his people. Judgment, at the end of the day, having had our chances, we're accountable for our sin. And redemption. God makes it possible by the sacrifice of the Lamb. And we're going to come forward, to understand that in terms of Jesus as the Lamb of God sacrificing himself on the cross to pay the price of sin and to redeem his people, to be a people set apart for himself. Let's have a little bit. Look. So the repeated patterns and themes in these passages go something like this. You get Pharaoh's response. Throughout the plagues, there's a consistent pattern of Pharaoh's initially resisting Moses' demands, offering to negotiate, then hardening his heart after relief is given. And that emphasizes God's sovereignty and Pharaoh's obstinacy and insistence on persisting in rebellion against God. Then you get this repetition of sort of formula statements, key phrases like, let my people go, let my people go, let my people go. Here's the point. And then Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. And you get the idea there. It's a warning against hardening your heart, right? And then this theme, that you may know that I am the Lord, and the covenant name for God being used in that way. I'm the God who's faithful and keeps his covenant and does what he says. That you may know that I am the Lord. Reinforcing the narrative themes of divine authority, of justice, and the battle of God's will and human resistance to the will of God. And then you get announcement against unannounced plagues. Most plagues are announced by Moses, while some, like the third and the sixth, and there's going to be 9 in this sequence, and then the 10th, which is cataclysmic. Those plagues, they give you this semantic layer where there's this repeat every third one. There's this predictability and at times inevitability. This is coming. You can't get out of this. And the major themes, I guess, across the whole thing are God's power against earthly power. The tension between the God of the covenant, Jehovah's divine power, and Pharaoh's earthly power, that dominates the narrative. The plagues expose the limits of human control and the supreme authority of God over his creation. Divine power against earthly power. Then judgment and mercy. The narrative is framed within this field of judgment against Egypt and mercy towards Israel. The plagues act as signs of judgment for one group, and they act as signs of deliverance for another, which is most clearly seen at the end of the thing when it comes to a big old climax in the Passover narrative. There's that exodus motif. It's all leading up to the physical liberation of the Israelites and the establishment of the forerunner of the kingdom of God in Old Testament terms. But it also highlights that Exodus. It highlights the significance of God of covenant, Yahweh, Jehovah, the redeemer of his people, culminating in that Passover where he redeems them, brings them to himself to be his people. And the Passover in Exodus 12. That's the theological, the semantic climax of the entire section. The transition from judgment to deliverance. The death of the firstborn, providing redemption. The death of God's firstborn son, Jesus, to provide redemption through his blood shed on the cross. Into deliverance in the kingdom of God. Lots of rich things there to be considering and to be enjoying as we reflect not simply on the Old Testament background, but on the New Testament that he's leading into. Well, the takeaway messages. The purpose of the plagues is God's power and deliverance, and the story of the 10 plagues is often seen as a tale of God's judgment against Egypt, but it's also a profound display of his sovereignty and power over all creation. Each plague was not just an attack on Egypt's people, but also this confrontation between God and these little deities and the belief systems they had. Egypt was a land with many deities, the gods of the Nile, of the sun, of fertility. But through the plagues, God reveals that he alone is the true creator of the ends of the earth, and he does what is according to his plan and purpose. And when Moses first approached Pharaoh, the king of Egypt stood firm, believing in the strength of his own power and his own nation's gods. But through Moses, 80-year-old guy, stutter, stick, stumble. Through him, God demonstrated his supreme authority, strength through the man's weakness. And the water turned to blood, and the Nile, Egypt's life source, becomes a symbol of death. And frogs and gnats and locusts emerge from nature to overrun the land. And darkness, the reversal of creation itself, falls on Egypt, showing God's dominion over the heavens. Each plague designed to dismantle Egypt's false sense of security and expose the emptiness of their gods, which were supposed to be controlling these things. But the poverty of that, as a belief system, as a ruling mindset, is being displayed to them. And those plagues also served another purpose. They paved the way for Israel's deliverance out of the hand of one who was not minded to let them go, but wasn't strong enough to hold on to them. God's not only judging Egypt, but preparing his people for freedom. Through this process, he's showing he'd not forgotten their suffering. He'd seen the cries of his people. And in his perfect timing now, he acts with power and grace. And today we're reminded that no force in this world can stand against the authority of God when he has a mind to show his people his mercy and his grace. Whether it be the systems of oppression, the trials we face, the spiritual battles we endure, God is able and minded to deliver his people. Power is unmatched. His love for his people is unwavering. And then we get the theme of the Passover. God's protection of his people through their obedience and their cooperation with his means of deliverance. If they hadn't put that blood of that sacrificial lamb on their doorposts, their fate would have been the same as that of the Egyptians. They're not special. It requires that simple act of obedience, which marks them out as the redeemed people of God, which results in their protection. The angel of death passed through Egypt, and he passed over the homes marked by the blood, sparing the firstborn of those households. That act of obedience to God's command, that lining up with his plan of redemption, brought protection and deliverance. And it wasn't the Israelites' strength or previous status that saved them. It was trust in God's promise, demonstrated by following that simple instruction to get under the covering, under the shelter provided by the blood. Well, there, the blood of the Lamb becomes a symbol for that redemption and for that protection. And as Christians, The Passover points to a greater reality: Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world by his own blood. Just as the blood of the Passover lamb protected the Israelites from death, so the blood of Christ protects his people from the ultimate judgment of rebellion, insistent, repeated rebellion against God. But it requires that act of obedience to come into his covenant. So what are we to conclude from all of this? There is a massive change that has taken place in the disposition of Moses. From being the self-reliant 40-year-old trying to do his bit to liberate his people with his own fighting skills in Exodus 2, verse 12, as he kills the Egyptian slave driver and buries him in the sand, massive change has taken place between that guy and this God-reliant octogenarian puts his trust in God and acts bravely and faithfully. The elderly Old Testament saint has nothing to offer but his well-directed stumble, his divinely inspired stutter, and his spirit-transformed stick. Everything good about the job comes from God. And this tale of two men, powerful Pharaoh and God-empowered Moses, who was weak, turns on the difference really between God reliance and Pharaoh's self-reliance for the deliverance of the whole situation. One of those guys epitomizes reliance on God alone, and the other epitomizes reliance on his own worldly power, and that alone in utter rebellion against God. And we all know who ended up at the bottom of the Red Sea in Exodus 14:28, and it wasn't Moses. Didn't know this by virtue of his human upbringing, far less his nature. He's a man who didn't always get this right, but he lived and learned to trust implicitly in the God who spoke. And the terrible thing to take away perhaps from this large narrative is that God's patience has limits. Human nature often seeks to persist in proud rebellion, overestimating its capabilities. God's patience has limits with that. Moses lived and learned. And the tragic thing about the king of Egypt is that, unlike Moses, he didn't live to learn. And the lessons to be drawn from that are probably quite obvious.